Okay, here we go. So the agenda for today is I wanted to share what we're doing with Proxy Cache. We talked about Proxy Cache, what it is and sort of the motivation for it last time. And I want to sort of deep dive, some of the issues that would come across as we're specking this. I don't really have any other, demos that I want to share this week. So let's do that first, and then if there's time remaining, we can discuss some other issues. So let me share my screen.
By the way, if anybody wants to discuss something, please add it to the agenda. So since you have the agenda for this meeting, if there's anything else you want to talk or bring up something, please add it. I'll put the agenda link to the meeting as well, to the notes. I really meant to the chat, but sorry about that.
So here's the 30 user stories we mapped out for Proxy Cache. So again, Proxy Cache, we're trying to solve the issue of when Docker clients can't connect to an upstream registry. You want to pull something from a registry that you have no access to. And so if you have Harbor deployed, you can start to use Harbor as that middleman to hit the upstream. So Harbor will pull it from upstream and then push it down to the clients. So one, it solves that issue of network connectivity, and also it's also minimizing traversals over the network and serving it locally, so it's faster and it takes a little bit less bandwidth, etc. So let's quickly go over some of the stories we've mapped out. This is a 2.1 feature that we're trying to deliver. So we are in for the first week of feature planning for 2.1. We're sort of like the tail end of the 2.0 release. So now would be a good time to add any comments, any questions that you might have on this ticket right here. So. Okay, so the first thing is, how do you create a proxy cache? What does it mean to create a proxy cache? And so the design we sort of gathered around is, so imagine you're trying to connect to a repository on the upstream that you have no connectivity to. So imagine creating a project or a proxy project, right? Similar to an existing Harbor project right now that allows you to map to that repository. So you create the proxy project, and specify the endpoint, the credentials, choose a name and alias proxy project. And that proxy project now becomes your front end, basically. So if you're trying to hit the repository on the remote, you can just Docker pull from the proxy instead. And you can do that for any number of target repositories, and they could be target repositories on the same hardware, on the same registry instance, or they could be across different target registries. So that's how we're thinking about this. Sort of the experience would be created at the project level. It's a special project within Harbor. So again, there's role-based access control. It's most likely going to be a read-only. So this ties into the third story here as well. So cache is pull only. You can't really push to the cache. The cache is populated from pulling from the remote repository via some sort of an internal mechanism. But in terms of user interaction, the user only pulls from it. The user doesn't really push from it. You can configure credentials for it. The cache can be public or private. And the experience we want to deliver to the client around pulling from the cache is we don't want any changes made to the pull command. Um, so we're talking about this one right here, image pull commands and pod specs. So as a user, I can pull from the remote registry without having to modify my pull manifest, right? The Kubernetes pod spec for that purpose. Usually there's an image path in the Kubernetes pod spec. I don't want to have to edit that. I want to be able to hit. I want to be able to hit my remote repository without having to edit the pod spec. Right? So imagine you're trying to hit gcr.io. So through the use of a mutating webhook or something else, that can be translated to a hardware proxy project that's been set up for it. Or if you specify the project proxy in the pod spec directly, then it'll just pull from the cache. But we don't want to have to. We don't want the user to change the pod spec in any way, because it breaks automation, breaks the ICDs, etc. So okay, so when you pull an image from a proxy, or you're pulling from your upstream and your harbor intercepts that request and you hit the cache instead. So a couple things can happen. And so here's the flow chart we've mapped out. So the first thing is the image is not in the cache, but it's in the upstream. So the cache will pull from the upstream, store it, and then serve it to the client. If it's in the cache and there's a newer copy in the upstream, it'll always pull the latest copy from the upstream before serving it to the client. So because you're pulling by tag, right? So imagine that tag is now mapped to a different digest on the upstream. It'll pull the latest digest and then serve that to the client. And if the cache, if the upstream doesn't have the image or the image has been removed, then it will basically discard the pull request. I think the reasoning here is mostly driven by intent. If it's not in the upstream, then it means it's probably not intended for the client. So the proxy cache will respect the wishes of the upstream and abort the request. And finally, if the image is in the cache and the upstream isn't available, then it will serve the request to the client. But without being able to update itself to the latest version of that image. And we also have the ability to configure some retention policies on the cache. So it's very similar to tag retention policies that you can configure in Harbor today, but this is sort of a long-running policy that's constantly enforced instead of something that you execute at scheduled times. So you can say something like, you can specify the retention time during the creation, which means how long the artifacts will live in the cache before it's removed. Or you can configure something like, I only want to retain the most recently 5 artifacts or something like that. -1 for infinite intention. Yeah, as a stretch goal, I think this is referring to you have the ability to constantly pulse the upstream. The cache itself will always update itself with the latest version from the upstream. Because we had talked about, the behavior would be to always pull from the upstream, refresh this copy anyway. So this is just doing it in the background to minimize the likelihood of actually doing it when there's an actual pull from the proxy. Yeah, so we need logging here, complete logs, because the Harbor is acting as a middleman for clients pulling from a remote. So I want to store detailed logs of all transactions on the Harbor side. So does anyone have any questions around some of the stories?
Is there anybody else on this call that could use the proxy cache? Is it a feature that's needed by your organization or your scenarios? Hey, Alex, have we made progress on the other scenario as well that Daniel had, since he's also on the call, around the need for a global account that has access, read only access to all the repositories? So we can talk about that a little bit too.
You're talking about the robot account, the special robot account for image scanners.
Yeah. Have we made any progress on the design for that, or at least the user stories?
I know we haven't. Um, yeah, we're probably gonna be doing that sometime this week.
Got it.
But yeah, so that's referring to um, for those who weren't attending the previous meetings, but it's basically for certain type of commercial scanners, uh, there needs to be a special robot account that has the ability to pull images across from Harbor, because Harbor has various security deployment policies. You can say something like, you know, any image with a certain vulnerability of a certain severity cannot be pulled. So there needs to be, right, because the security scanners are using the robot accounts to pull the images across before they can scan. So they need to get around that somehow. But, yeah, hopefully we'll have more on that for the next meeting. I'll work with Daniel on that. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to share. 2.1 is targeted for, I think, end of August. So we can look at some of the features that are being planned. So if you guys have any questions on things that are being worked on for the next release, please look at this particular swim lane 2.1 product suggestions. We'll turn those into commitments at some point. They're just some of the ones that we're thinking about doing. So, online garbage collection, P2P, proxy cache, some of the latest stories for this release. So the theme is around better image geodistribution, some improvements to robot accounts. Yeah, Steven, do you want to share something about the 2.0 release? Or does anyone else want to share anything about the upcoming release?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So essentially, To The Dough RC2 is on GitHub. So if you go under the releases, that's available. And the targeted TA for the full release general availability is 1 week from today, so on the 13th. And at that time, we'll have the blog post out talking about all of the different features of To The Dough. That includes OCI, SSL between the different components, Slack integration for webhooks, individually callable webhooks, and uh, obviously Trivia is the built-in new scanner, but that is included with Harbor. We're not discussing the operator in the blog post because we already had a specific targeted blog post for the operator, but everything else will be in there. And next Wednesday, we'll have everything wrapped up, and if everything goes well, documentation and everything else will be in there. Be aware that at the end of the month, on the 28th, we also will have a Harbor webinar where we're going to basically talk about Harbor To The Dough and everything else that's happening within the general community.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
I guess if nobody else has any questions, concerns, or anything that they want to bring up, we can probably give everybody back some time. So I guess the first time that we extended the meeting to 1 hour is also the first time that we don't need even half an hour. So that's kind of funny. guess nobody else has any questions. Well, everybody have a good rest of your day. If you're in China and you just go back from vacation, hopefully you had a good restful time with family, um, and now we're back to back to work, I guess. All right, everybody. Bye from me. Thank you.
All right, thanks for attending. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.